The Darkangel, Chapter 2, Vengeance. Who will kill the vampire? Said Ariel softly. The vehemence of her own words surprised her. She was kneeling beside the wide, low windows of the deserted alcove just off the empty dying chamber. Night outside was dark and still. Her mouth tasted like metal. She had not known she could feel such bitterness. She remembered waking hours, many hours after the sun had set, and seeing old Bomber along with some of the other servant women murmuring over her, or moving quietly about the darkened chamber. Bomber had laid a cool, damp gauze cloth on her forehead. Time passed, and then she remembered Edwin's mother, the syndic's wife, shoving suddenly into the room, the woman falling back deferentially, uncertainly before their mistress, who came to stand over Ariel, white-faced and screaming. "So she's awake now, is she? Why wasn't I told? My daughter is dead because of you, you worthless chattel." The woman's hair was dishevelled, her thin cheeks were tear-streaked, her garments rent with mourning, her face above Ariel looked like Edwin's, only older. One long finger she levelled at Ariel. "Why could you not have protected my daughter? You should have given your life for your mistress." The woman's breast heaved in a sob. "Why could the vampire not have taken you instead of Edwin?" And then the sharp crack of the woman's hand against Ariel's cheek. So sudden tears sprang to her eyes. Startled murmurs from the servants, the syndic hurrying short-breathed into the chamber, pulling his wife away. "Come off, my dear. Such displays of grief are untowardly. You'll demean yourself before mere serving women." And then got Bomber's great bulk bending over Ariel again, and fingering her stinging cheek gently with murmurs of, "There, there, child, there." Ariel, beside the alcove window, stared out into the night. Since her recovery she'd kept as far from Edwin's mother as she might. She thought then of Edwin, the mistress she had served almost before she could walk. She recalled it vividly. The aristocrat's young doted upon daughter, pointing her out to her father at the slave fair 12 summers gone, and begging him to buy that one. Edwin, who'd been her constant companion since, more friend than mistress, though a proud and high-handed friend, her only friend. Ariel sighed bitterly. Now all things had changed. His daughter dead, the syndic planned to sell Ariel soon. She had heard the servants whispering in the halls. His wife demanded it. Ariel thought of the provincial slave fairs in Orme, bids and shackles and confinements and blows. Here in the syndic's house Edwin had always protected her. She would be sold northward, she was certain of it, deeper into the hills. Here at the plain's edge, owned servants were sometimes treated with tolerance. But it was worse in the mountains' heartlands. Tales of slaves beaten or worked to death. It chilled her thinking of it. Ariel closed her eyes to the dark outside. "I cannot live without Edwin," she thought. "I'd rather die than brave the slave markets of the Orme." She pulled her tangled thoughts away from that and tried to think of other things. Already the village poets were beginning to sing of the syndic's hapless daughter, stolen away for the vampire's bride. Yet with all their singing and moaning and murmuring, in all the fortnight since, not one of Edwin's friends or kith had stirred a step to climb the steeps again to confront her murderer. "That is not justice," Ariel raged silently in despair. Holding the Icarus's great black feather up before her face, she opened her eyes and stared at it. Its dull darkness absorbed and mollified the white and smoky lamplight. Without the shade of night, now 3/4 of a half-month old, loomed blacker than birds' eyes. The white plain Vavorite gleamed faintly in the pale blue light of Oceanus. "Someone must kill the vampire," she breathed, as the feather, almost pleading, the quill's black plumage stirred, "that Edwin may be avenged." "There is no vampire," said Derna gently, her only companion in the small empty room. She sat behind Ariel, combing her hair carefully in the back where the head was still tender. "Then what is this?" demanded Ariel, twisting around. Her hair caught in the teeth of the comb and pulled sharply. Catching Derna's hand in hers, she ran the older woman's long, leathery fingers over the feather. "I don't know," hissed Derna. Her voice was always soft and sibilant, nothing like Bomber's deep-sounding tones. "Don't know," insisted Ariel. "What does it feel like?" The other sighed and groped for the little horn comb hanging tangled in Ariel's hair. True, dear. It does resemble a feather, but it cannot be. Perhaps it's a leaf or flower of some high mountain plant no one has ever seen before. Dinner! Cried Ariel. Her fellow servant stared straight ahead and said softly, assuredly, There are no birds even half so large. Birds are rose or pale blue or subtle green, yet you say this thing is black. There are no black birds. It isn't from a bird, said Ariel. There are no vampires, Dinah told her with infinite patience, just as there are no mudlicks or water witches. Ariel stared off across the room and held her tongue. Dinah had been this way as long as she'd known her. Sometimes she wore an eerie look when she was in the mood for tales. Then she swore absolutely by the creatures of the dark. But other times her eyes seemed to clear a little and she scoffed at them as nothing but mad mind wanderings. The latter humour seemed to be on her now, and Ariel despaired. Much as she shrank from Derna's queerness, her calmer moods could be even more galling. She wished the other had not found her, not come creeping into the little alcove where Ariel had retreated to gaze out at the night. She wanted to be alone. She felt Derna beginning to run through her fine yellow hair again. The air is thin high up on the steeps, she said. Fatigue can trick your eyes. Perhaps a landslide. Perhaps she fell. I don't know. The comb pricked and pulled at Ariel's scalp. Derna sighed. You mustn't grieve, darling. I know it wasn't your fault. Ariel stiffened and stared at her. Derna seemed to be listening, but Ariel saw no one in the outer chamber. The older woman said softly, conspiratorially, Edwin was not the easiest mistress to serve. Derna pulled a few of Ariel's hairs from the comb. But she admired you in a way. Did you know it? How you took her mother's every blow with never a sound. You know she used to fly into fits of tears if her father so much as slapped her. Derna fluttered her fingers to let the freed hairs fall. She was a bit jealous, I think. Did you sense that, my heart? Resent it even? Your mistress's jealousy? What do you mean? Demanded Ariel. Derna's words astonished her. Edwin jealous? And of her? Impossible. I loved Edwin. Say nothing to me, hissed Derna softly, and I have nothing to tell. She found Ariel's chin with her hand and turned it away to her face, straight ahead. She spoke almost beneath her breath. Everyone believes you, you know, or else holds their tongues. The syndic believes you, else he'd have had you beaten for the truth. Ariel felt the comb parting her hair. They went up into the steeps with candles, had you heard? Looking for the place. They didn't find anything, though, no wonder. You can't see a thing by earthlight and candles. The comb tugged at the tangle in Ariel's hair. They did find a few more of those leaves, feathers, whatever they are, so I heard. You were smart to strew them about. The body will have fallen all to ash by the time the sun's up. Derna's voice had hushed to a mutter. She laughed quietly, companionably. You're much cleverer than I took you for, little one, and there must be a deal more spirit in you than you've ever let show. Tell me, did you plan it or just seize an opportunity? At sunrise you can take me up and we'll hunt for the bones. Ariel stared at her. Her throat went tight. She wanted Bomba suddenly. She wished Derna had never come. You'll find no bones. The only bones you'll find are at the sea things dead long years. The only bones you'll find are the sea things dead long years. Derna continued, combing her hair, unconcerned. Don't fear, she said. You can trust me. The older woman's voice was full of pity. I know that circumstance, the altitude, a sip of horn liquor, circumstances can make anyone a little mad. Ariel pulled hard away from her. I didn't, she said. You think I killed her, and I didn't. It was the vampire that carried her away. Derna shook her head. There is no vampire, child. There is! Cried Ariel. Her teeth were clenched. Outrage welled in her against the Icarus, against Edwin's faithless kith and friends, against Derna and her soft, slippery words. The feather crumpled in her hand. There is! Not so, said Derna firmly. Now let me comb your hair. No, said Ariel, backing away. All is well, crooned Derna with compassion. I understand how you must feel. Have I not told you? I killed someone dear to me once too. Ariel looked at her with horror almost as deep as that she had felt on the mountain and remembered one of the ghastly tales Derna had told her all alone in secret. It had been nothing like the silly, soothing old tales of bombers. It was not even like the other ones Derna herself had ever told, for this story she had sworn utterly had really happened, and to her. Derna sat, comb in hand, near where Iriel stood and gazed at nothing, her eyes bright and filmed over blind. Iriel shuddered and shrank from her. "What's wrong?" said Derna, turning her high-held head in a trance. "Come here." "No," said Iriel, falling back another step. The madwoman reached for her. "Come here, I want to comb your hair." "No!" cried Iriel, and fled. The black feather fell from her hand as she ran through the empty dining room and then the crowded weaver's room. She tipped over a basket full of yarn, spilling the skeins across the dusty floor. Scrambling up, she fled to the room, unheeding of the angry shouts that followed her. She found Bomber in a spinning room, hunched over in one corner, nodding off to sleep. Her great bone spindle lay fallen on the floor, its fine wool thread beginning to unwind as her thick fingers relaxed. The other woman spun and chattered, ignoring the old nurse. "Bomber!" cried Iriel, falling down beside her. "Bomber!" Bomber spluttered and half woke, sat a moment blinking, then reached her massive arm to enfold the frightened girl. What's this, little one? More nightmares?" "It was Derna!" cried Iriel. She said..." Bomber woke up a little more and gave a snort of disapproval. "Derna, huh? You stay away from her, child. Old tail twister, she's little Fay, you know." Iriel buried her face in the soft fold of Bomber's bosom and sobbed, "I will kill the vampire." She choked, longed for Edwin and hated her murderer. "I will kill him." Her whole body shook. She thought again of the syndic's wife. Why could the vampire have not taken you instead of Edwin? Now Derna's words had made her feel even more deeply it was somehow all her fault. The old nurse clucked, patted and stroked her hair for a while. Gradually, Iriel's weeping quieted. She clung to Bomber and felt no consolation. The old nurse settled herself a bit more comfortably, sighed and drifted off into sleep again. The woman spun on, unconcerned. The climb up the cliffs was steep and Iriel was out of breath, for she was hurrying. Solstar had barely been peering over the rim of the western deserts when she slipped away from the others at their morning prayers in the courtyard of the syndic's house, praying to the unknown nameless ones, they who had first fallen from the sky in fire to quicken this, a then dead world, the moon of Oceanus, into life. Little was known of them, and they were not spoken of. Iriel quickened her pace along the brittle mountain trail. No one had seen her leave the village. She carried only the long knife she had stolen from the kitchen and the small sack of provisions. She did not know how long she might have to wait, but she would wait. She'd wait until the Icarus came or the food ran out and she died. Surely he will come, she thought. If only I wait long enough. He must come. "Hear me, O unknown nameless ones," she panted, padding rapidly up the narrow, rising path. She had never prayed before, but she heard the syndic do it, offering up the house prayers each morning and the village prayers each night. "Hear my words," prayed Iriel. "Let there be justice for the killing of my mistress and my friend. Not any of her family seeks to avenge her." "As I would," thought Iriel, pausing for breath. Her head was spinning from her haste. "Let them hear me for Edwin's sake. I myself am of no consequence." The unknown nameless ones granted few prayers, she knew, and generally only personages of great importance dared petition them. She eyed the star-strewn sky uneasily, and hoped fervently no blue-white lightning would dart down to silence her presumption. It was not courage that had prompted her to make this climb, only despair. The slave fairs would be held next day month in Orm. "Answer this entreaty of one small slave, O ancient ones," she cried into the thinning air, "and I care not what becomes of me after. What did her life matter any more? Edwin was dead. I will go into a new slavery quietly, or dedicate myself at the temple to your service, or spill my blood on the altar cliffs in sacrifice to you. What you will." All three prospects terrified her, but she made herself speak the words. Surely the gods would have pity on one so desperate. The dark vast sky above loomed empty but for stars. She gasped for breath and realised that the tears were streaking her cheeks. Her jaw hurt from having been clenched a long time hard. She scrubbed at tears angrily and shoved away from the cliffside again which she had rested and hurried on up the path. "I'm coward enough without weeping," she muttered. She gripped the long knife tighter in one hand. "But let him come," she prayed, silent again. "Only let him come." Solstar was a few degrees into the star-littered sky by the time she reached the summit. The air was thin, cold, there was no wind. She put her provisions down and sat on the hard, hot rock. The sun rose slowly, 1/2 a degree every hour. The constellations turned slowly. The waning planet did not move, sat motionless in heavens like a great, slow, blinking eye. When the sun was 4 degrees into the sky, Ariel ate a handful of bedchill seed and took a sip from the water flask. When Solstar was 6 degrees above the plain, she ate again and stood up. Her legs were stiff and sore, one foot pricked numbly. She paced back and forth over the crumbling rock to get the circulation back. Then she sat down again and waited and dozed, ate and waited, and again he did not come. The sun was 16 hours into the heavens when she discovered the cracked mouth of her water flask had leaked half its contents to the thirsty rock. Solstar had climbed another 12 degrees when she drank the last of the water and threw the flask away. The sun was 36 degrees into the heavens when she ate the last bedchill seed. Her mouth felt tight and dusty and she was hungry still. The stars wheeled slowly on. Her thirst and hunger grew until she felt dry and hollow as a reed. Solstar was halfway to its zenith when the vampire came. He came out of the northwest as before, but this time she saw him from a long way off. At first she thought it was just hunger making the stars wink out occasionally, but no. She could see more clearly now that she had concentrated, that he was closer, that this small but growing shadow across the stars was more than a simple figment of her own fatigue. He was still far, and all she could make out clearly of him was the churning of his dozen wings against the dark sky and the faint, eerie glow of his garments. He came very rapidly as before. Iriel stood up, shaking a little. For a moment she seized with the overriding desire to run, hide, escape, lest he see her. No, let him pass, she almost prayed. Let him fly on. But there was no mistaking that he must see her now, for she was standing, and no mistaking that his course was taking him directly to her. She held the knife up in front of her in both her hands. He alighted to the cliff's edge, only paces from her. She felt the wind of his alighting, and shuddered, but stood fast. His wings stilled, yet stayed spread. He draped and folded them about him in such a way that she could see little of his figure and nothing of his face. "You've been waiting for me," he said. His voice was startlingly quiet, clear, even beautiful, like a deep, full ringing bell. The thinness of the air did not seem to affect it at all. "Yes," said Ariel. Her voice was nothing but a muted squeak. She gathered herself. "Yes, I've been waiting for you," she cried out boldly, and she could barely hear the words herself. "I knew you'd be here when I returned," the Darkangel said. "Then you would have done better to have not returned," she shouted. She wondered what manner of hideous creature stood behind those wings. "Do you mean to kill me?" his voice asked calmly and reasonably. The vampire's wings rustled, but he did not part. Hatred welled in Ariel, and she cried, "Yes! You have taken Edwin, and I will kill you for it." "I chose her as my new bride," he said. "It's great honour." "It's death!" spat Ariel, rage choking her. She heard the vampire sigh behind his wings. "After a fashion, I suppose, but that's a small enough price." "And how many now have you wrung the price from, Icarus?" she demanded. "How many maidens have you stolen for brides?" Silence followed for a minute, as though the Darkangel was thinking. "I think I've had 12 brides in as many years," he said, and then he laughed. "I am a young vampire." Ariel gripped the haft of her long blade tighter and started towards him. "Stop!" he cried, his voice all of a sudden commanding and stern. "You have not the power nor the will." Then he opened his wings, and Ariel found she could not move for wonder. Before her stood the most beautiful youth she had ever seen. His skin was pale and white as lightning, with a radiance that faintly lit the air. His eyes were clear and colourless as ice. His hair was long and silver, and about his throat he wore a chain. On 14 of the links hung little vials of lead. He was smiling at her slightly, a cruel smile, that even in its cruelty was beautiful. Ariel felt her knees buckling. The vampire caught her as she fell and seized the knife from her. He clasped her to him. His body was colder than shadow, so cold that she felt the warmth of her own body running away into while his own cold invaded her. The air around him was bitter chill. It smelled heavy and sweet as licorice. She felt his great wings buffeting around her suddenly, and then realized they must be flying. "Where are you taking me?" she tried to say, but he was holding her too tightly for her to speak, to even breathe. She felt the windless emptiness above the atmosphere. She felt the vampire's dozen wings straining in the void. We must be among the stars by this time, she thought vaguely, before the chill and airless dark intruded on her thoughts and she lost consciousness. Her first awareness was being able to breathe again. He'd relaxed his grip. The atmosphere was rare yet, thin enough to make her gasp, but she could still breathe. The Darkangel's great wings beat about her. She sensed the buoyancy of flight, and she was cold, still, so very cold. They were descending, she felt it. The rhythm of his wings had changed, and in the distance below she heard a thin wailing, keening, almost screaming. It grew louder and more terrible as they drew near. Shriller it became, more raucous, hoots and shrieks and howls of hysterical laughter, until they were hovering in the midst of it. The buffeting of his wing beats grew so fierce then that Ariel half swooned. The screaming swelled and rose. The Icarus touched down and stilled his wings. Then he let go of Ariel, and she dropped in a heap at his feet. "Get up," he said. Ariel raised her head to look around her. They were on the terrace of a tower, a tremendously high tower of cold grey stone. It sweated in the light. A spiral stair twisted up the central core, a turn or two above the level of the terrace to the base of the pole where the standard flew. It must have been woven of witch's breath, thought Ariel. It was so light that even the seldom wind at such height could lift it and send it screaming back from the pole in long furls. Gargoyles sat on the battlements, lean as they were, and the same hideous damp grey as the stone. They looked at her with hollow eyes and rattled their silver chains. They had wings of bats or wings of birds, most of them, and licked their beaks or teeth with forked and doubled tongues. Two paced restlessly before their platforms, others whined or picked at their claws, or groomed their mangy fur or feathers, or lizard skin or scales. The nearest one snapped at Ariel. She drew away from them, pressed closer to the vampire, but he moved off from her towards the hole in the floor where the spiral steps entered into the tower. "Come," he said. "They'll not attack you while you're with me, but you must not come here alone." Ariel looked first at him, at his beautiful bloodless face, his colourless eyes and the long silver hair. She'd never seen any living being so fair as the Darkangel. She glanced back at the starved, ragged gargoyles. They had a sharp stench to them like rotted cheese or buttered milk. Ariel could think of no creature foul enough to compare with them. The Icarus paused gracefully at the steps. All his moves were grace. "Do you come?" Ariel turned back to him. "I am to be your bride," she said, not questioning. The certainty of it overwhelmed her. The Darkangel looked at her and then laughed a long, mocking laugh that sent the gargoyles into a screaming, chattering frenzy. "You!" he cried, and Ariel's heart shrank, tightened like a knot beneath the bone of her breast. "You be my bride? By the fair witch, no, you're much too ugly." Ariel was silent for a long moment. "Then why have you brought me here?" she asked at last. "You're to be my wives' tire-woman," he said. Then he turned and began to descend the stairs. Ariel got to her feet but did not follow. The gargoyles shrieked and strained at their shackles. The vampire halted after a moment and turned to her again. "Do you come, girl? What's the matter with you?" "I'm not to be your bride," said Ariel. The vampire snorted. His lip curled with contempt. "And why in this world should I have to do with you? Certainly you can see your looks are hardly worthy as one such as I. Look yourself, there's colour to your skin, and one can see the blood in your veins. You are scant and scrawny, your hair is yellow, and those fig-green eyes. There, have I said enough?" Ariel looked at his flawless white skin that had no delicate tracery of blue veins beneath. His hair fine as filament and platinum fair. Her own skin and hair were dark by contrast. The Icarus continued, "However, despite that you are hideous to look at, I have brought you here. You can spin and weave, can you not, to serve as my wife's tiring woman? Are you not delighted?" When Ariel did not respond, the Darkangel frowned and folded his arms. "Girl, I did not think you fully appreciate the honour I do you." Ariel came then beneath the hard gaze of his disapproving eyes. The menace of his brooding made her flinch, and together they descended the tower into the keep. The castle was immense and empty. The vampire led her through room on room of cold grey stone, rooms that contained nothing but the occasional piece of furniture, a carved alabaster couch beside a fine silk tapestry perhaps, and that was all. The Icarus looked about him with satisfaction. Iriel gazed about her in display. Yes, he said. They took most of it with them when they left. This used to be a king's palace, did you know it? But the king's son died young and his father grew old without an heir. Then I came when he was dying and the land had no champion to defend it, so the queen took her people far to the east across the Sea of Dust to found a new kingdom. This is my palace now. Iriel followed the Darkangel through the empty rooms and empty halls. Have you many servants? She made bold to say at last, for she hardly felt fear of him now, only a vast sense of insignificance. There is only you, he answered. I had another tyrant maid before you, but she tried to run away. She did not get far across the plain. I caught her by the hair and strangled her, then threw her to my gargoyles. If you try to leave here, I'll do the same to you. Iriel nodded. After a time she murmured faintly, And what is to be my room, my lord? Any room, he told her. Find one that suits you and take it. And where are your apartments, lord? She asked. I have none, he said. There is only my bedchamber, and it is locked. He gestured to the right. Through an arched doorway, Ariel saw another chamber, at the end of which stood a straight stair leading up to a landing. She caught only a glimpse of an ornately carved door, standing shut at the head of the stair, before the Icarus turned down a hallway and Ariel had to hurry to follow. He nodded back over his shoulder towards the chamber door without turning. I sleep but once a year. He led her down corridors and stairwells, through the lower rooms, through the lower floors and washing room. Though long, dry and deserted, the storage rooms where no supplies were kept. And finally the kingdom... Sorry, let me start that bit again. He led her down corridors and stairwells, through the lower floors. He led her down corridors and stairwells, through the lower floors, the washing room, long dry and deserted, the storage rooms where no supplies were kept, and finally the kitchen of bare shelves where no herbs or onions hung drying from the ceiling beams. But what shall I eat? Cried Iriel. The vampire shrugged. You must find your own food. The other ones always did. There is a garden. Perhaps you will find something there. You may know, sup but once in a 12-month. On your wedding night, said Iriel. The Darkangel stood fiddling with the leaden chain about his neck. I've shown you enough of the castle, he announced suddenly. Now you must meet my wives. He led her up a winding stair down a long narrow hall to the little door at the very end. It opened onto a tiny windowless room in which there were 12 and one emaciated women. Some stood in corners or crouched, leaning back against the walls. Some crawled slowly on their hands and knees. One sat and tore her hair and sobbed. Another paced along a little of the far wall. All screamed and cowered at the entrance of the vampire. Yes, they are a sight, he said to Iriel. Though they were all beautiful when I married them, I did not think the climate here agrees with them. Wives, he said, this is your new servant. Do not encourage her to run away, or I shall have to kill her as I did the last. The women looked at Iriel with caverns where their eyes should have been. Their starved cheeks were translucent in the lamplight. The skin on their faces pulled so tight Iriel could see the imprint of their teeth through their lips. Their arms looked like birds' legs, skin on bone, with no flesh in between. They cringed, they trembled. One of them moaned. Her voice was hollow. Her hair was all coarse and dry as blighted marsh grass. These are wraiths, and not women, Iriel thought suddenly. The soulless and undying dead. You must spin for them, the vampire was saying, and weave. Nothing heavy, you understand. They are very fragile. Wool or even silk weighs them down, so they cannot walk. But they must crawl about the floor like crippled beggars. I do not come to view them often, but when I do, I expect them to be presentable. Not wool or silk, said Iriel, watching the wraiths. Then what shall I weave? You must find it yourself. Something grows in the garden, perhaps. He turned away as if to leave. Which of them is Edwin? Said Iriel. Her voice had fallen to a whisper as she realized that one of these creatures must have once been her friend. The Darkangel shrugged. Surely you don't expect me to remember which one is which. He left her standing in the middle of the room. Iriel ran after a pace or two. Where are you going, my lord? She cried. He turned and said impatiently, What business of that is yours? You're but a servant, and I've spent quite enough time on you. But what if I should need to find you? Stammered Iriel. Why should you need to find me, said the vampire. Your duties do not concern me. But, groped Ariel, I shall be all alone. Alone? Cried the Icarus. You have 12 mistresses and one. And then he turned and strode off down the hall, leaving Ariel in the room with no windows and the wraiths. End of chapter 2. Yay! So we've made it to chapter 3. I'm going to take a little break and hopefully I'll be back with you really soon. Any comments or any suggestions to improve things will be greatly appreciated, and I hope you'll have as much fun and enjoy this story as much as I do. Obviously, like I said, I'm not a professional. I've never read a book on an audiobook before. I'm just trying my best, and I really hope that you enjoy it. Thank you for listening. I'll see you at chapter 3.